Okay. Well, it's good to be back here face to face and see some familiar faces. The pandemic has, of course, taken a toll on all of us in regard to face-to-face meetings. I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary. I've been doing things at Hershey for 27 years now, I realize. And I bring you greetings from the seminary. We have affiliated with Moravian University, so our website will change if you ever go on that. And for the next the next 4 weeks, including this one, we're going to be looking at the state of religion, Christianity in particular, and congregations in particular, in the United States. And I've got to confess that this is going to be a bad news, good news pattern. There is some bad news, and we'll look at that first, about the state of religion in the USA. And then in future weeks, we're going to look at what does the Presbyterian heritage say about the church, its nature and purpose? What is the theology of the church? And then finally, we're going to look at, is there anything that could be done to revitalize the church? Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about Derry Presbyterian. You folk are the exception. So perhaps you should be studied to see what is it that you're doing right. But in most other sectors, denominations are declining. Most congregations are declining in terms of any metric that you want to use. Energy, social influence, numbers, endowments. Seminaries are declining. Judicatories are declining. Presbyteries, in my instance in the UCC, associations and conferences. So you look around in most congregations and you can see that the population's declining and aging and not being replaced significantly by younger people. So that's the bad news, which today's going to be depressing. We're going to look at the statistics about the decline and some theories about why is this happening. Now, it had been thought maybe 20, 30 years ago that this was mostly a problem for the Protestant main line. And by that I mean Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, United Church of Christ, possibly Methodists, but it's not. It's just that we were ahead of the curve. The decline became most evident with the Protestant main line, but now it's clear everybody, every Christian tradition, and not only Christian tradition, but religious traditions are declining in the U.S. That's been made clear by Gallup polls, surveys by the Pew Foundation, even the Congressional Survey, a polling institution at Harvard and another polling institution at Chicago. So this has been corroborated by a number of different actuarial polling institutions. And what they found, and this became clear about a year ago, is that the number of folk who identify with Christianity in the United States has dropped below 50% in the first time in American history. And that religious affiliation in general has declined, or let me put it this way, let me put it negatively. The percentage of the population that is not religiously affiliated with anything, not a mosque, not a synagogue, has declined to 30%, when in 1972 it was 6%. So that you can see that trajectory. That's pretty steep, and a lot of that decline happened in the first decade of the 21st century. It had been declining slightly ever since 1972, but then it sort of fell off the cliff. So that's more than 30% of the population at least who don't claim any religious affiliation. And when they are given some more qualitative interviews, they don't say that they're atheists or that they're agnostics. Mostly what they express is just indifference. Like, religion is just not on my radar screen. I just don't think about it one way or the other. And that's a bit frightening. Another thing to keep in mind here is that the drop-off is particularly strong with younger generations. I thought the drop-off would be evident in my own generation, baby boomers, but it's really not all that significant. As I just look back at all the secular people I went to college with, I thought, well, you know, they're not going to church, but turns out many of them are, which surprises me. The drop-off starts with the Generation X, and then it becomes increasingly strong with millennials and Generation Z. So the younger the generational cohort, the more likely that the person will not be part of any kind of religious institution whatsoever. They also, these are not the people who self-identify as spiritual but not religious. This 30% I'm talking about identifies as neither spiritual nor religious. Don't join religious institutions, don't practice any spirituality at home, we don't look at crystals, we don't believe in reincarnation, we're not followers of Shirley MacLaine, none of that. They just don't care about religion. And the groups that people sort of thought were doing okay aren't. There had been a theory that the main line was doing terribly, but evangelicals were expanding and flexing their muscles and exercising political power. It turns out, no, they're not. Southern Baptists are in decline. Independent churches are in decline. Mega churches, worship centers, are also in decline. Not so much in Lancaster County, but everywhere else in the world. Lancaster County's unique in that regard. And when people do self-identify as evangelical, it turns out they don't even know what that means. So after the 2016 election, pollsters were asking qualitative questions as exit polls, as people came out, and they'd say, well, who'd you vote for? And they'd say, you know, Donald Trump. And they'd say, why'd you do that? And they said, because I'm an evangelical. And then there'd be follow-up questions. So you read the Bible every day? They said, no. And so you pray at home frequently with your family? No. So you've had a born-again experience? No. And then they'd ask, well, what's your favorite verse in the Bible? And they'd say, oh, I don't have one. So it turns out they were identifying evangelical simply with the religious right, the political religious right. So the numbers of folk who are evangelical might even, genuinely evangelical, might even be less than was evident in the polls. It had been thought, well, Protestants might be declining, but surely Catholics are doing okay. No. Number of birthright Catholics born in the United States dropped sharply with the pedophilia scandals in the Catholic priesthood. And if you factor out two crucial things, high birth rate and also immigration of Latin Americans, many of whom are Catholic, the Catholic Church would be tumbling off the cliff in regard to numbers. So the decline is slight, but that's mostly due to immigration. And it's also clear that the second generation often does not stay Catholic, including with Hispanic immigrants. So sometimes it was proposed that this was just a problem for the white church, but the African American church was doing fine. Actually, no, it's not. It's doing better than the white churches, that's for sure. But they too have experienced about a 12% decline since 2000. And mostly in urban areas and mostly with young men. That's becoming a crisis in the black church, how to retain young African American men, particularly in cities. There was thought, well, maybe this is just a Christian thing, and maybe folk are deserting Christianity and joining some other religion. But no, they're not. Judaism is in as steep a decline as is the Protestant main line. In fact, its rate of decline accelerates by about 3% every year. A lot of folks still culturally and ethnically identify as Jewish, but not religiously as Jewish, don't practice. In fact, that many rabbis are becoming very, very alarmed by this. Then it had been proposed, well, maybe people are leaving Christianity and Judaism and becoming Buddhists or Hindus or practitioners of Native American traditional religions. Turns out, no. In fact, Islam and Buddhism in the United States is declining more quickly than anybody else. The Eastern religions from Asia have a great deal of trouble retaining the second generation. They move here, let's say, from India, China, Japan, Korea, practice their religion. The kids, however, who are born here, they don't absorb it. They're much more influenced by the schools they go to, and they want to assimilate. They exhibit a trend that long ago a sociologist, Will Herberg, identified, that the second generation tries to forget what the first generation knew. And that's, they stop speaking the traditional language, they stop eating traditional ethnic food, and they just want to blend in to America. It had been, what Herberg had also said is, but the third generation tries to remember what the second generation forgot. You know, they try to recover ethnic food, ethnic dances, maybe even the language. But it turns out, not now, that the folk from Asia really successfully forget their Asian heritage, including the Asian religions. And even the spiritual but not religious group is declining. A few years ago, well, maybe 10, 15 years ago, if you went into, in those days, Borders, now defunct, or Barnes & Noble, there was a large spirituality section. Usually there was a little tiny Christian section and then a gigantic spirituality section. Now that spirituality section has shrunk to just one bay. So even the chat rooms, the websites, the folk who would just hang out in Starbucks and talk about religion, that's declined. So putting all that together, I think the inevitable conclusion is that the decline of any particular religious body in the United States, Presbyterianism, Shiite, Islam, anything, the reasons for it are not unique to that religion. It seems to be systemic and pervasive. In other words, if Presbyterianism at the national level, not in Derry, but at the national level, is in decline, that's not the fault of Presbyterianism uniquely, because everybody else is experiencing the same thing. So there must be pervasive, systemic, cultural dynamics going on that account for why is it that every religious body is having trouble. And so it's not just the parking lots aren't big enough, or everything would be different if only we had more contemporary music. The places that have contemporary music are declining. The places with gigantic parking lots, many of the spaces are empty. COVID, to tell the truth, didn't do anybody any favors. You know, that accelerated this phenomenon. But it was there long, long before COVID ever struck. So, in order to revitalize anybody, any religious body, a denomination, a judicatory, a congregation, I think it's important to try to figure out what is it about our culture that's responsible for this? Why is it that when America used to be regarded as a uniquely religious nation, now it is becoming as secular as anywhere else? Why? I'll invite you to advance your opinions too about this, because there are many. And the thing to take into account and remember is people really don't know. There are hypotheses and guesses to try to figure out what's going on, but no one really knows. But there are a variety of theories, some proposed by sociologists, some by denominational leaders, some by theologians. So today I'm going to try to describe them and see if any of them make sense to you, and also can you think of any others? Maybe these are misleading or just plain wrong. The first one, and this is maybe appropriate for a town with a gigantic medical center in it. First one is, it's the rise of science. That as science has progressed ever since the 18th century and really accelerated in the 19th, science and technology have tended to push religion into the background. That our ancestors, for example, used to, well, if you had a disease, pray. But ever since the 19th century, you can do that, but better yet, go see a doctor. Get some medical attention. Rely on science and technology. If you have a pain, don't just pray and meditate. Take an aspirin. Take some sort of analgesic. So the thought had been that as science and technology can explain more and more, that religion gets pushed into the corner. So it was also thought that the more technologically advanced and the more rooted in science a culture is, the less religious it will be. And to tell the truth, that sort of worked in explaining Northern Europe and Japan, both highly technologized by the 20th century and both experiencing sharp declines in religious attendance and religious affiliation. So it was thought that, well, England, Scandinavia, Germany, Japan, they prove our point. Once you develop a scientific base in your culture and technology prospers and people learn to trust it, they are going to, they're not going to say to themselves that thunder and lightning are due to Thor's hammer or to the wrath of Jehovah. They're going to look for an explanation. And ever since Benjamin Franklin, we no longer think that when it thunders, God is bowling, which actually had been a belief in the Middle Ages. So for example, just to give some credence to this, I do a lot of work in Denmark. That's where my research takes me often. And Denmark is highly technologized. Something like 70% of the population makes a living in something related to technology. Their science programs in universities are huge. So I was there one year during Palm Sunday. So I went in Copenhagen to the main cathedral, it's Lutheran, on a high holy day, Palm Sunday, and discovered, as I got in there, that there were about a dozen Lutheran clergy officiating in the chancel, doing various things with the communion utensils and reading different things and responsible for saying different prayers, all in Lutheran vestments. 12 of them. There were 9 people in the congregation, 8 besides me. So the number of clergy outnumbered the quantity of worshipers. And the worshipers looked mostly bored. Not sure why they were there. And that's indicative of what happened. Oh, and by the way, there were so many clergy because in Denmark, Lutheranism is still the established religion, and the clergy are paid by tax dollars and paid well. So a lot of people who want to be clergy, but not a lot of people who want to go to church. And I always wondered, what if my salary were paid by the government? Yeah. Anyway, and that's indicative of Germany, England, the rest of the British Isles except Ireland, every country in Scandinavia, most of Eastern Europe, at least the northern part. Church attendance and church and interest in anything religious is sharply down. In England, about 6% of the population go to church more than once every 2 months. And that, in England, still has an established religion. I mean, it's Episcopalian, it's Anglican. And that, however, seems to depress church attendance. So a lot of folk have said that there does seem to be, in the rest of the world, a correlation between how technologized a nation is and how seriously they stress science, and it's inversely related to how religious they are. So that seems to hold, except until recently it did not hold in the United States. In the United States, which was one of the most progressive scientifically and technologically nations in the world, before the end of the 20th century, church attendance, church belonging, synagogue attendance, private devotions were still phenomenally high. During the Eisenhower years, where church attendance was at its peak, it was probably almost 80% of the population belonged to a church, a synagogue, or in those days, it was very rare, but maybe a mosque or an ashram. Those days are gone. I have but we used to call that American exceptionalism, that the rest of the world had gone secular and scientific, but there was something unique about the American experience, the American spirit. We were religious, and we are spiritual in a way the rest of the world is not. I had a friend, actually this friend in Slovakia, whom I said this to you, say, in the United States there's this notion of a religious exceptionalism, that we don't go the way of Europe or Japan. We're, in spite of being technologically advanced, we're religious, and that just seems to be part of our DNA. But I said, but now that's declining. And she said, it's not that you were exceptionally religious. It's just that you're slow. So there's a cultural lag that the Atlantic Ocean creates. And now you're catching up to Europe. And congratulations, you're going to have all the problems with religion that we have had in Europe for several generations. So that's one theory. The problem is the rise of science and technology, and science can explain things that religion used to try to explain. And so religion is on the retreat. And if you got a problem, most people's instincts are find a technician who can fix it rather than go to a clergy person. If you're anxious, depressed, go to a secular counselor. Get a psychologist. Find the right kind of pharmaceuticals. But don't necessarily go to a clergy person for counseling or spiritual guidance. And in fact, a recent survey asked people, if you have a personal problem, who are you most likely to trust and go to share your problems? You want to guess what occupation was number one? That was bartender? Close. That was number two. Hairdresser. You got it. How did you know that?
Well, look at my hair.
Yeah, that was it. It was hairdressers And barbers were number one. Bartenders were number two. And then secular counselors. And ministers were like number 8. So that just shows that secular occupations and secular practices have usurped certain roles that Christian leaders and Jewish leaders, etc., used to fill. In fact, it's so bad that in response to that survey, some seminaries, I won't say which ones because this is being recorded, considered having a dual degree program in ministry and hairdressing, and even some in bartending. So if that's where people are going, then we should adjust to that fact. So that's the first one is science and technology are responsible for the decline. It's just that the United States has been rather slow about it, but now we're catching up. And the other one is that's closely related is that ever since the 18th century in Western culture, there's been a shift away from being interested in spiritual things, transcendence, God, another dimension, to focusing exclusively on earthly happiness. And some folks have noticed that that's probably because prior to the 18th century, earthly happiness wasn't really part of anybody's life plan. Yeah, it was not an expectation. Think back even in the 19th century when for a male in the United States, the life expectancy on the average was 35. So if you made it to 40, you were lucky and old. But as medicine and other things, better agricultural practices, the availability of technological products, and as one historian pointed out, most importantly, anesthesia, made people think that it's possible to live a life on this earth that's pain-free. And that prior to the modern period, nobody would have ever thought that. And it was estimated that before anesthesia, including things like aspirin, most human beings spent 70% of their life in physical pain. If you had a headache, there's nothing you could do about it, except maybe if you were Scotch, have a Scotch, yeah. And if the pain persisted, have another one. But then you wake up with a headache. So alcohol was the only painkiller. If you had a toothache, well, you could try to yank it out yourself or go to the local barber and have it pulled out with pliers. But that would hurt and then it would bleed. So life was short and life was painful. Plus the possibilities of war, violence, theft. So the theory was that before the modern period, most people had no expectation that they would be happy on earth. And therefore their hopes were put in another dimension, going to heaven, or a spiritual realm that maybe you could access through prayer, and that being spiritually happy, not physically or happy in a worldly sense, that was just not on anybody's radar screen. But now that's possible. In fact, it's so possible that even if you have a life problem, something's gone wrong, you've lost your job, well, play a video game. Go to Hershey Park. There are all kinds of things you can do to distract yourself so you don't focus on your existential problems. And if you're anxious and depressed, you can get medication. You can get a mood stabilizer, and then you can be happy again. Go on a vacation, take a cruise, as long as there's not COVID. COVID actually, people thought it might burst this bubble, the notion that you can, if you play your cards right, you can have a happy life, but it turns out it did not. church attendance has not gone significantly up. I'm including Zoom there. So some folk have said it's the fact that people orient their lives towards having a happy family, having a successful career, having a sufficient leisure time, having an engaging hobby, getting the respect of their peers, and that's it. That's all they expect out of life. If they get that, they're happy. I was also in Denmark once, living in a dorm with college kids, and I was thinking to myself, well, this is Denmark. This is Scandinavia. You know, this is the land of Edvard Munch and the Scream and the plays of Ibsen and Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote books on anxiety and despair. And Ingmar Bergman movies. So I was thinking, you know, these folk are deeply in touch with the tragedy of life. So I started to talk to some of my college companions, and I actually said at a party, you know, I'm so impressed that you folks seem to be having a good time. You know, you're drinking a lot of aquavit, which is like grain alcohol, and you're jolly. And in fact, I noticed that you seem to be jolly most of the time. You know, but I know down deep you have this darkness in your soul. You know, that you're worried about the meaning of life, and you're thinking about death and guilt. And my conversation partner just looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, well, yeah, you know, meaning, I know Scandinavians have historically been obsessed with the meaning of life questions. Maybe it's because you have these dark winters with no sunlight, but it seems to be endemic in your culture. And he just looked at me and said, "Death?" I said, "I never think about death or the meaning of life." He said, "My understanding of life is you're here to have a good time, to party, and one day the party will be over. But that's okay, because then we'll be old and we won't be able to party anyway." And I thought, this is pretty worldly. And I realized he wasn't kidding. So that indicates or that's evidence for the notion that maybe it's the expectation that you can have a good time in this life that has led to a lack of interest in religion. Another major theory is religious pluralism that happened in the United States, and now it's happened in Europe as well, coupled with mobility. If you put a lot of people together who are members of different religions, and you enable them to be mobile, you give them cars and opportunities to leave the town that they grew up in and have a different set of friends who are of a different religion, that will inevitably erode their trust and their allegiance in the religion in which they were born. Let me give an illustration of that. I grew up in the 1950s, and in my hometown, which was small, it was 2,000 people on the Jersey Shore, there were only two kinds of persons. There were Baptist people, and there were Methodist people. And that was it. There were a couple of Italians who were Roman Catholic, but we were afraid that they were in the mafia. My mother was Baptist, and my father was a Methodist. I was regarded as the product of a dangerous mixed marriage. Yeah, and folk watched me to see how I'd turn out. You know, would I be a sociopath? In high school, my chemistry teacher had also been my Boy Scout troop leader and was also the person who did the prayers at the school sporting events, and was also the mayor. And he was my Sunday school teacher. So wherever you looked, I got this Baptist or possibly Methodist message. And I thought, that's all there is to human life. These are the only real options. And the only real existential question is, can you lose your salvation or not? The Baptists said no, the Methodists said yes. So then I went to college, which was not in my hometown. And I was in a quad with 3 other 18-year-olds. One of them was a very, very secular Jewish guy who hated all religion. Another was a member of the Black Panthers and just called himself X. He was going beyond Malcolm X, and he got rid of his first name part, and he was just X. And the other was a young man from India, not an American Indian, but first generation, just moved here, Indian, whose last name was Krishna. So I knew enough, even though I'd grown up in Baptist Methodist land, that Krishna was the name of a Hindu deity. So I asked him about that. You know, how'd you get this last name, Krishna? Isn't that a divine name? He said, oh yeah, it is. Yeah, that's my father. And so I probed further. Krishna, the God, is your father? And he said, oh yeah. He said, my mother is a worshiper at what you would call a temple in which she worships with various males who come in a sexual way. And for that moment, her partner is the incarnation of Krishna. So you people would probably call her a temple prostitute. But for us, it's really a religious leadership role. So he said, when I was conceived, the human male was an avatar of Krishna. I said, can't wait for Parents' Day. You know? Yeah. And then my next thought was, this is different from being Baptist or Methodist. Yeah. But all these people were nice. They were kind. They were just. They lent me money. So inevitably, I began to say, how do I know that my Baptist and Methodist heritages are right and theirs is wrong? How do I know that being a devotee of Krishna is any better than being a Baptist? Or how do I know that being a member of the Black Panthers is any better than being a somewhat progressive Methodist? And that is, according to some sociologists, the story of many Americans. Grow up maybe in a religiously homogenous area like Lidditz, and you end up being Moravian, and everybody you know is Moravian. But then you go to college, you join the army, you develop a skill that's needed somewhere else in the world, and so you move. And you discover that your neighbors and your coworkers or your classmates are not members of the same religion, and that inevitably challenges your own beliefs. How do I know I'm right and they're not? It's easy to believe you're right if everybody you know believes the same thing. But if you're thrown into a situation of pluralism, which is made possible by cars, transportation, and now even more so, the internet and technology, odds are you're going to end up with people close to you, might even marry one, who are not from your religious background or any religious background. So some sociologists say inevitably that's going to weaken religious commitment. And they point out that even if you have a pious parent or a pious pair of parents, it's less than 40% likely that the children will stay in that religion or any religion. Well, I'll share this anyway, even though it's being recorded. Most of the folk on my faculty have adult children. None of them go to church. And that's pretty hardcore. If you have parents who are theologians, biblical scholars, church historians, and the kids grow up going to church all the time, but then they stop when they hit adulthood, that shows that there's a problem. It had been thought that, well, yeah, people stop going to church when they go to college, but when they get married and have children, they'll come back. No. Not, with the baby boomers, that still was true, it turns out, but not for subsequent generations. So that's the problem is religious pluralism and mobility and being exposed to a variety of conflicting religious messages, which just confuses people and they throw up their hands and say, well, I don't know what's true. The next two are not as popular, but they've been proposed. One is people, at least in the United States, and also in Europe, it's been going on for a long time, are turned off by religion because of its politicization. That in many countries, let's take the United States, we have a very vocal and visible religion of the political right. You could call it red state religion. And it can get extreme. During the January 6th insurrection, or whatever it was, there was a gentleman who had a banner, big banner, with a picture of Jesus on it, with a MAGA hat. And he was interviewed afterwards and said, you know, that's a nice bit of funny irony. And he said, oh no, I wasn't being ironic. If Jesus were alive now, he'd be a Trumper. And you get the same thing on the political left. Bumper stickers that say, you know, Jesus was a liberal. And congregations that function mainly as, say, the chaplaincy corps or the praying wing of either conservative Republicans or progressive Democrats. That's happened in Europe long ago, where religious groups would identify either as conservative or as progressive. And now it's happening in the United States. And the observation from sociologists is most people don't like that for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you're, let's say, a very politically liberal Christian, and a young one, and it's 2016, and you go to a Bernie Sanders rally and you feel the burn, sooner or later people are going to realize, I can get this high just by going to a Bernie Sanders rally. I don't have to go through the inconvenience of getting up on a Sunday morning and going to church. That's peripheral. The real thing, the real emotional jolt, is the political rally. And so that politics, people begin to realize that the religious stuff is just window dressing. The real commitment and the real energy is to a political program. And you could say the same for the religious right. And the observation is, most people sooner or later get tired of that, or they never liked it in the first place, because they didn't like the polarization and thought that many of the purposes of religion are not exhausted by political commitments. That religion is supposed to put you in touch with the spiritual, with the transcendent, in a way that politics and political programs and parties cannot do. And therefore, folk just drift off. Or congregations get tired of fighting about hot-button cultural, political issues, and folks stop coming. So that's one theory. Then there's another one. This will be the last one we talk about. That's okay. Changes in family structure. A lot of folk have noticed that in every religion, the primary transmitter of faith is the family, the nuclear family or extended family, and particularly parents. Maybe in the United States, particularly mothers. But if that's true, then as mothers work, have careers, are not as available, as there are more single parent families, as parents or single parent or double parent have to have multiple jobs in order to survive, there's less and less time and less energy to devote to the religious instruction of the young. So that prayer at meals stops because families don't have meals together that much anymore, or don't have time to have a lengthy meal. And prayers at bedtime, Bible reading, or the reading of the Quran, or the reading of the Torah, that there's not time for that. People are too busy, have too many other commitments, partly because of economic reasons, so that the religion does not get transmitted to the next generation. And there is some statistics showing that children of single parents, where the parent has to work a lot, are among the least likely to have a religious affiliation when they become adults, or even while they're children. So that's the problem is the change in family structures and family dynamics and the marginalization of the family. Think back to most of you can think back to the 1950s. Remember the Eisenhower revival and the billboards that said the family that prays together stays together? Well, families can't pray together that much because they're pulled in different directions because of their jobs and commitments. So those are the main sociological theories about why is this decline happening. And just to recap, it was the problem science and technology. The problem is the expectation of earthly happiness. Then the problem is religious pluralism and mobility. And then the next one was the over-politicization of religion. And then the last one was changes in family structures. So what I'll do now is ask you if you have any other theories. Because these are all speculative. They're all hypotheses. Nobody knows for sure. And for the sake of our viewing audience, I'll repeat your question or your remark.
Has there been any, I'm sorry, no, go ahead. Has there been any deeper look into sort of that number 3, things beyond politicization that were push factors and not just pull factors, that pushed people away from church?
Yeah, so the question was, is there anything besides politicization that may have pushed people out of church, where they just said to themselves, I don't like this anymore. I don't feel comfortable here. This might be included under politicization. Hot button cultural issues, for sure. Like I even understand that in this congregation, masks have been an issue. And that's universal in congregations. You know, who are you to tell me that I have to wear a mask to come in here? I'm going to find a congregation that's unmasked, or I'll just stay home. So hot button gay marriage was one big one. Earlier than that, ordination of women. There have been a variety of cultural tensions that have pushed people away. And it had been thought that, like, if someone is more conservative but they're in a progressive congregation, they'll leave the progressive congregation and find a conservative one. It turns out often they don't. They just don't go anywhere. They just say, I'm done with religion. I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think kids, at least these days, are really overscheduled during the week with activities, sports, and so forth. And then the rise of the internet on a Sunday morning, well, that's a time I can sleep in finally, or can communicate with my friends real easy on the computer. I think that has something to do with the young people coming up through.
Right. So there the remark was it might be overschedulization of children, and I'd throw in maybe parents as well, and the rise of the internet. And actually, thank you for mentioning that, because some sociologists have said that the internet makes it possible for folk to find community online, which means they don't have to go to church to find community. You can stay in bed on Sunday morning and just join your chat room, or read a blog and blog back, and you can do that with anybody in the world, so that you're not restricted to a congregation or even any face-to-face human interactions. I realized that I was going through my deleting emails to clean out my computer this week that many of my best friends I've never met face-to-face. You know, they mostly live in Europe. Some of them I've met, some of them I haven't. But I know them and I interact with them more than I do with people in my physical vicinity. Yeah.
This is probably also affiliated with that number 3, but what about just the portrayal of religious leaders and religion in popular culture? I mean, is it even being done as much? And if it is, you know, is it, oh, I want to be like that, or what a hypocrite?
Yeah, and that's so the notion was, what about the portrayal of religious leaders or religion in general in popular culture? And I think there's something to that, and I want to expand it by the non-portrayal of religion in popular culture, its absence in a lot of sectors. And that started, well, at least with the 1950s, where the notion became, if we have religious freedom in the United States, and if we are religiously pluralistic, then it's best to not mention religion, or else people might fight. It was an exercise in conflict avoidance. Or back in the 1950s, when networks were required to have some religious programming, the strategy became, find somebody who's so generic, so antiseptic, that he can't offend anybody, which just bored everybody to tears. You may remember, if you're of a sufficient age, that around 1 o'clock before networks went off the air, they used to have a talking head come on with an allegedly inspiring message. Only the religious leaders' hands were tied. They couldn't say anything that was particular to any religion, nor could they say anything that was supposed to be controversial. So they ended up just boring everybody to death. And when that regulation was removed, nobody regretted it. And so what's happened, in order to not offend anybody's religious sensibilities, the media stopped introjecting overtly religious themes into their programming. Notice even, and I'm going back. So I'm going back to the 1960s. Remember even such a wholesome, allegedly wholesome program like the Andy Griffith Show and Mayberry. There were no ministers in Mayberry. There were always exceptions. Some sitcoms with a minister, but usually not, so that you got the impression that religion is just not important to human life because it's not portrayed in TV programming. Or if it is portrayed, it's because they need a villain. So you need an Elmer Gantry type. You need a predatory minister, or a pedophilic priest, or somebody who's dipping into the collection plate, so that the portrayal of religion became something nefarious. That reached, I think, its heyday in the very popular Dan Brown books and movies, like the Da Vinci Code, where the villains were almost always crazed, deranged, sociopathic Catholic priests, who all were albinos and looked grotesque, and were masochistic and sadistic. And that was popular because I think a lot of the population said, well, that fits. Yeah, religious leaders are kind of creepy. And the Catholics are the creepiest of all. Notice I have not seen, although there might be out there, a movie or a TV show or something streamed in which the villain were a band of Presbyterian terrorists. Yeah, it usually goes for Roman Catholics. Yeah.
Well, the other is the series now that where the priest or the clergy is a detective.
Yes.
He's not, or she isn't doing anything.
Yeah.
She's just solving mysteries.
Right. Yeah. What was that Masterpiece Theater show? Barchester? Well, there's Father Brown and Branchester. Yeah. Where, you know, the main character is an Anglican priest who solves mysteries. And you wonder, does this guy ever celebrate the Eucharist? Yeah. Does he ever do pastoral care? Every once...
30-second sermon at the end of it.
Yeah. So there's a, even when there are religious leaders portrayed in a positive light, it's not because they have a religious message. It's because there's something else and they happen to be clergymen. But the thing about that is they're really good detectives. And incidentally, they happen to have a religious role. Yeah, I think there's a hand back there. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one that I think I keep hearing more and more about.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is another hypothesis that, especially for younger generations, it's the perception that the older generations of religious folk talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. That there is, in other words, there is hypocrisy. And they don't see any notable difference between the way that church goers or synagogue goers or mosque attendees live and the way that a secular person lives. So they get to the conclusion, if congregations are just a bunch of hypocrites, I can be a hypocrite in the privacy of my own home. Yeah.
I think we all seek affirmation from those around us. And I think that in the few discussions that I've had with coworkers over the years, most of those were non-church. And their interpretation of church was this man standing at the pulpit, handing down edicts and judgments of them. There was no discussion, no conversation about the whys of anything. In every case, there was no Sunday school involved. There was no where you could have a conversation about the whys and how you relate, and you could put the nuance of why the teachings are what they are. So it was this person up there standing, saying things that whenever any of us talk, we're wrong. I don't care what the subject is, we're going to screw it up. And you can't have a relationship when there's not give and take. And so religion, at least for my coworkers, was someone up there making statements and there was no reality to it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that because that's another important one because there have been observations by sociologists that especially with younger generations, when they're exposed to religion, like by the media or maybe even face-to-face, what they get, particularly on television, is somebody pontificating, somebody giving a didactic exhortation or a sermon telling them what the absolute truth is. And that's particularly true on television with televangelists. And as you mentioned, and therefore there's no interaction, asking of questions, exploration, or mutual conversation. And sociologists point out, particularly younger generations don't like that at all. That they have an allergic reaction to authority and claims to have absolute truth. Because they've gone through public school systems that, at least at their best, tried to teach them to think for themselves, to entertain a variety of different perspectives and try to sort them out, to have conversation, and in church, they think that doesn't happen. So it looks like a top-down imposition of truth, and they really don't want that. So I think we're running out of time.
You're down to 1 minute on this.
Oh, okay.
But if you go over time,
Okay.
that's
Oh, okay. Any other observations?
I do have one that came in that's saying it turned people off from the Dover School Board that they decided to teach intelligent design instead of Darwin's evolution.
Yeah, and that would be a subset of that. People, younger people in particular, don't like to be told what the truth is, and they particularly don't like it if it seems strange or implausible, as in the Dover school system. They don't like book burnings, don't like book bannings, but would like to see a much more freewheeling, open-ended discussion of religious topics. So yeah, I know some kids who were in that school system at that time, and they really hated it. They hated that Board of Education. So that's another important one, and that's what gets the attention in the media. You know, that's what makes it on television. So, for example, right here in Derry Presbyterian, we're having an exchange